As I said, we're getting ready for a brand new year. I mentioned our Sunday school class. It doesn't seem that long ago, several of you were scared to death because 2000 was coming and you thought the end of the world was going to happen then. And now it's 2015, so don't worry. The end of the world is not coming for at least 7 years. And amen, yeah. Then we'll see what happens after that one. All right. Like many of you, Christmas is kind of a time to get with family, although usually on Christmas Day that doesn't happen, and it didn't this year either. We had Pastor Jason, his family, Christmas Eve, and we celebrated Jeremy's family's Christmas the day after Thanksgiving because they were here. But I got a kick out of the excuse my youngest granddaughter gave. She did something bad. I can't remember what it was. And her dad took her aside, and you could hear off. He said, "Now listen," he said, "you can't be acting like that." She said, "What do you expect? I'm only 4. I came across some funny excuses that parents have set in for their kids for school. Let me share them with you. Please excuse Johnny from being absent on January 28th, 29th, 30th, and 33rd. Marge could not come to school because she was bothered with very close veins. Okay. John has been absent from school because he had 2 teeth taken out of his face. Or, please excuse Megan from PE for a few days. Yesterday she fell out of a tree and misplaced her hip. And then this one, please excuse Johnny from being. It was his father's fault. Okay. Just excuse the poor kid for being. I don't know. There are a lot of funny excuses that I've heard through the years from people why they don't come to church, why they don't serve, why they don't do this, why they don't do that. But I do want you to know that excuses are not funny to God. God does not take them lightly. God does not like excuses, especially when we're trying to excuse something that we're supposed to do and something we know that God wants us to do. Ephesians 5, as we think about a new year, tells us to see then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Wherefore be ye not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is. Now, to put that simply, he was saying, live wisely in verse 15, leverage your time in verse 16, and learn God's will in verse 17. I remember when Carpe diem was the big catchphrase for a while. I think we ought to change it to Carpe memento, seize the moment. Every moment God gives you, seize it and use it for His glory. Every time you can do something for God's glory, do it. Seize that opportunity. Go for it. Folks, God doesn't want us to kill time. He wants us to fill our time. In fact, wasting the gift of time is an insult to the giver, and that's God Himself. By the way, if you're a parent or a grandparent, use your time with your kids and grandkids wisely, because it's far too short. It just seems like yesterday, Grant was always wanting to come over to our house. Now he's 17 and he's no longer interested. He's got better things to do, and better fish to fry. And that happens as kids get older. They're off and on their own. Hopefully my great-grandkids can love us for a few years when that happens, and we can enjoy them. But it amazes me how quick our kids grow up. And they're gone, and they're building their own lives. So don't waste that window of opportunity you have with them. Teach them the ways of God. Keep them close to Him. Now, when he talks about, wherefore be ye not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is, the Lord's will is primarily focused on transformation, not on location. We tend to focus on, I want to be where God wants me to be. God's more concerned with you being what you ought to be. He's more concerned about transforming you. And if you want to know God's will, then do what you already know about God's will. And as you do what you already know, God's going to pick it up and help you from there. Now, we do know one thing very clearly. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. For this is the will of God, even your sanctification, that ye should obtain from fornication, that every one of you should know how to possess his vessel in sanctification and honor, that no man go beyond and defraud his brother in any manner, for God hath not called us unto uncleanness, but unto holiness. Notice he said, this is the will of God. It's the will of God. God wants you to be clean. He wants you to live a holy life. He wants you to live a life that glorifies Him. Now, today we're going to take a look at some major excuse makers. They started off strong, and then they just fell off. I think it's kind of a timely thing for this time of year. Their resolve to get the job done and their excitement had turned to excuses. It reminds me of something I heard this week. A resolution goes in one year and out the other. Think about it for a minute. It's true. So true. Now, I want you to turn to the book of Haggai. It's the second shortest book in the Old Testament, and truthfully, it's a bit difficult to locate, so let me tell you how to do it. It's go to Matthew, and then hang a left 3 books. All right? Go to Matthew, the first book in the New Testament, then hang a left, and go back 3 books, and you'll be at the book of Haggai. Wasn't that simple? A lot easier than memorizing the minor prophets, believe me. I still get them jumbled. Now, let me just share with you some verses here. In the 2nd year of Darius the king, in the 6th month, in the 1st day of the month, came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet unto Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Josedech, the high priest, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, This people say the time is not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. Then came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet, saying, Is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses, and this house lie waste? Now therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, Consider your ways. Consider your ways. Before we jump in, we need to understand a little bit about the setting for this book. And in order to properly interpret this book, you've got to put it in its historical context. You got to see, where does it fit in the history of Israel? So I'm going to do my best to briefly explain to you the story of God as it unfolds in the Old Testament. Now here's the deal. If you'll lock in, I'll try my hardest to explain a whole bunch of history very quickly in a way that's understandable and hopefully interesting. And I'm excited because I think this brief overview will help you have a deeper appreciation for the Old Testament. Once you learn the major points of God's redemptive history, you'll have a better appreciation of how all the books go together and how to apply their lessons. So we won't start with Adam and Eve. You all know about them and how they sinned in the garden, and because of them, we are born with that sin gene inside of us, and it's natural for us to sin. You're not called a sinner because you sin. You sin because you're a sinner. And when God saves you, He puts a new nature inside of you. Instead, we're going to jump on over to Abraham, and there's a reason for that. Abraham is the father of many nations, but particularly of the Jewish nation. Excuse me. Abraham came from a pagan country. He was promised a place and a people by God. He and his wife gave birth to a son named Isaac. Isaac became the father of Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel. They ended up in bondage in Egypt for about 400 years, 430 to be exact. And then Moses came along and led them out, and God gave His people instructions on how to worship Him in a portable worship center called the tabernacle. They would pitch the tent, they would set it down, they would worship, they'd put it back together and pack it up and head on to the next destination. Once they got there, they'd unfold the thing again. Now, personally, I admire them at being able to do this. I've tried to put up a little 2-man tent before. And I know that it just doesn't work all that easy. You know, you get one end in and get the one end attached, and you get back to the other end. About the time you get it attached, the front end falls apart. And you go back and forth and just play all kinds of silly games with it. And I remember one time I'd gone off with the men. We had a men's retreat, and I had my own tent, and I had my eldest son with me. And we thought we had the thing all set up, and we got in there. And we had a storm that night. Rain began to come and winds began to blow. But we had, material canvas down on the floor of it, so we weren't too concerned about it. And just before we fell asleep, a little gust of wind came by, nothing mighty, but the whole tent came flying right over our heads, just like that. And thank goodness the floor wasn't attached to it. We'd still be tumbling to this day. So tents are not easy, but they did that. After they finally entered into the promised land, and after means they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, they were given 3 kings. Each of them ended up ruling 40 years. The first one was Saul, the second one was David, the third one was Solomon. Most of you have heard of Saul. Almost everybody's heard of David, and if you got any smarts, you've heard of Solomon because he was supposed to be the wise guy in all this group. Now, David wanted to build a permanent worship structure. He wanted to build a temple for God so the people could worship. But God wouldn't allow him to do it because David, as God said, was a man of too much blood. He'd killed too many people in war and whatever, and he just said, no, David, but I'll allow you to put stuff aside for a temple. So David did. Put materials aside, money aside, gold and silver, all the rest. And Solomon built the magnificent temple. It was the centerpiece of the nation. It was the focal point of their worship. But then Solomon died. And boy, did things go downhill. Israel was split into 2 kingdoms. The northern kingdom had 10 tribes. And often in the Bible, they're referred to as Israel, which gets really confusing because you've got the 10 tribes, but then Israel is also used to talk about the whole land. And then you have the southern kingdom, which was the tribe of Judah. By the way, that's where you get the word Jew, from the tribe of Judah. Now, because of the disobedience of God's people, the Assyrians came after Israel, the 10 tribes, and they scattered them every which way. You've heard of the 10 lost tribes of Israel? That's them. They went all over the place, although, in all honesty, they're not lost today. They may be in different countries, but they know what they are. They know what tribe they're from. And Jews are very meticulous about that, so they hang on to that. But everybody calls them the lost 10 tribes because they got scattered and nobody knew how to bring them back together. They were everywhere. And you would think when that happened that Judah would learn its lesson. But it didn't. And it continued to turn away from God. God finally allowed the Babylonians to come in, and they captured the tribe of Judah, these people, and they destroyed Jerusalem. They decimated the temple, tore it down. I mean, nothing left except ashes and a few pieces of stubble and rock. And then they deported these Jews to what is now Iraq. They deported them over in that area. Many of God's prophets predicted that captivity would not destroy the nation. They prophesied that within about 70 years, the people would be allowed to return to their land. Actually, that's exactly what happened. Under Cyrus of Babylon, King Cyrus allowed the people to go back to Israel to rebuild their temple, to rebuild the city. They went back in 3 stages. The first group was about 50,000 Israelites. They went to Judah with Zerubbabel. Don't you love that name? What mother would name her child Zerubbabel? You know, when I was young, it came out Zerubbabel. It's just kind of hard to stop the bubbles part of it. But Zerubbabel was there, and 2 years later, they finished the foundation of the temple. Now, it's a big place. It's not always easy, but laying a foundation is hard work. We laid the foundation here. And I remember watching Don and Ken, and every now and then they let me hold a board, as they go back and forth and pouring the cement and getting everything in and exact measurements and exact depth and all the rest of it. So they had to do that. They took 2 years, and in 2 years they got the foundation done. Unfortunately, they got tired, they got discouraged, and they quit. So then God sent them 2 prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, to encourage them to finish the project. The third stage was that he sent Ezra and Nehemiah also to help restore the spiritual fervor, and Nehemiah rallied them to rebuild the walls. So they accomplished some things. Now, let me introduce a word that I think is important to understand the whole second half of the Old Testament. It's the word exile. It refers to the time that Judah was in Babylon as a punishment for her faithfulness. Some of the Old Testament prophets ministered before the exile and actually prophesied about it. Some of them actually ministered during the exile, and then a few others after it. Well, 16 years have passed when Haggai comes on the scene. The foundation is there, but there's so much more that needs to be done. And he delivers 4 brief sermons in 5 months. 4 sermons, 5 months, and you love this about him. Every one of them is brief. And it's neat to read it because the message is clear. It's time to finish what was started and put first things first. Now, his style is simple, it's direct, and he doesn't waste any words. It's time to get our priorities right. It's time to put God first. And I thought to myself, you know what? That's exactly what we need for this new year. We need to realize who needs to be first in our lives, and that's God. Look at verse 1. He said, in the 2nd year of Darius the king, in the 6th month, in the 1st day of the month, came the word of the Lord. Notice even the small L or the small O, R, and D are capitalized there. It refers to God there as the covenant keeper. It says that they met on the 1st day. That would be the day when everybody would gather to worship. So a lot of people would be present. And keep in mind that Haggai is speaking. They're standing near the foundation that's now covered with weeds and all kinds of junk because it's just been sitting there and left to waste. Now, Zerubbabel is there. Zerubbabel is the civic leader. Joshua, not the Joshua who fought at Jericho. This is a different Joshua. This Joshua is the spiritual leader. He's the high priest. And this message, first of all, goes to the leaders and then to the people. In the 2nd verse of the book, Haggai lets loose. He says, thus speaketh the Lord of hosts. And he tells us what he has to say about their excuses. He says, this is what the Lord of hosts says. Look at, this is not Haggai's suggestion. This is not Haggai's idea. This is what God says. And the name that's used here in Hebrew is Jehovah Sabbath, which refers to him as the commander of all the armies of heaven. Did you know that term is used 270 times in the Bible and 14 times in this little book? Jehovah or Yahweh occur 34 times in 38 verses of this book. And it means that he's the self-existent one. He's the all-powerful one. He's the ultimate promise keeper. He keeps all of his promises to his people. Now, before you come down too hard on these people, I mean, God's really laying it low. And Haggai doesn't try to mince words. He doesn't get eloquent. He just says, folks, this is the way it is. And we need to remember, these same people were at least brave enough to leave Babylon and come back to an area that was just laid waste by destruction. They were willing to come back and to rebuild. And they were living in enemy territory. And they had to do something, so they started to build. They got the foundation up, and then there was a lot of opposition from people around the warring tribes, and they had to deal with that, and they didn't know what to do. And so they finally just kind of give it up. They just set it aside. Now, one other thing I think is important. King Cyrus had already died. The guy who showed them so much favor and said, I'm going to give you this and this and this and this, and he was the new king was putting on pressure now for them to stop working. Folks, if you've been saved for a while, then it's no surprise to you that problems always come up. Difficulties and discouragements set in. It comes along with the joy and the peace and the blessings of God. You see, Satan doesn't want you to have joy. He doesn't want you to have peace. He doesn't want you to have God's blessings in your life. And so God allows him to throw some little obstacles in the way. We call them trials, valleys, hard times. But God allows him to throw a few of those in our way because if we respond to them in the right way, it's going to increase our faith. And we're going to appreciate God even more. If we respond to them in the wrong way, you'll still be a child of God, but you're not going to have that joy. You're not going to have that peace. And you're not going to have God's blessings on your life. So I want us to see that God first addresses their hearts without urging them to get back to work. He goes to the heart because, folks, the heart is always the issue. Proverbs tells us to guard our hearts, for out of it are the issues of life. Now, I had that long introduction because I got 3 short points, all right? First is this: proceed, don't procrastinate. That's what God's telling them. Even though you've got a lot of problems, God says, I want to just summarize your excuse. Look at verse 2. And he summarizes it. This people say, the time has not come. Look at that. This people say. God doesn't say, my people are saying. He says, this people. In other words, they're not acting like God's people. They're not acting like people who love God because for 16 years they've done absolutely nothing for God. They've let the foundation sit there and they've let it rot and they've done absolutely nothing for the Lord. Now notice too, none of them are making the claim that it's not important to build God's house. They just never seem to think the time was right. Isn't that the way it happens for a lot of us, folks? We put something off, and it keeps getting later and later, and months go by, and then a year goes by, and then a decade goes by, and then your kids are 40 and 42. And you say, what happened? You kept off. If you'd asked them why they hadn't been working on the temple, they might have said something like this: don't misunderstand me. I'm all for rebuilding the temple, but somehow the time's just not right. We're in an economic downturn right now. There's a lot of political uncertainty going on. I've got other things I've got to take care of, like my farm and my house. I'll get around to making God a priority someday, I promise. Sound familiar? Boy, I hear that a lot. Someday I'm going to put God first. Realistic. Listen to some of these I've heard recently. I've got too much going on to make it to church every Sunday. I mean, come on. It's my only day to sleep in. People at church are hypocrites, and I don't like some of them. I agree. So do you. I can't commit to anything right now because of my sports schedule. Maybe later. I'm thinking about serving when things settle down a bit. What's it like when things settle down? Every time things started to settle down in my life, something else would come up. And there never seems to be a real settled. And that's okay. I like adventure. See what God's going to do next. This one, I'll give more when I have more to give. In other words, I won't trust God, but I'll give more when I've got some more to give. I'll surrender myself totally to the Lord after I finish school, when I get some rest, and after I retire. Or Benjamin Franklin put it this way: I never knew a man who was good at making excuses who was good at anything else. Good point. And that's what God's saying. God's saying, you're not acting like my people. You're not much good for anything. You're making all kinds of excuses, but you're not doing anything. You're not doing what I've sent you there to do. You're not doing my work. Secondly, prioritize God, not your own pleasure. In verse 3, God asks a very penetrating question. It says, then came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet, saying, here it is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses, and this house lie waste? Now basically God's saying, are you telling me you can't finish the temple? Or are you telling me you won't finish the temple? Because God knew what the answer was. They won't. It's not that they couldn't, it's just that they wouldn't do it. They were all about themselves and not about God. Now notice something. They're not just spending their time building houses, they're building luxurious homes. When you read that word sealed, most of us don't even know what it means. The word sealed is similar to paneled. It's the idea of a paneled house, but don't think of a cheap way to put up a wall in the basement, because that's not what he's talking about here. Paneling back then was like wainscoting. It was made out of cedar or oak. It was typically only used in the palaces of kings. In 1 Kings 7:7, we read about Solomon. It said, he built the throne hall, the hall of justice, where he was to judge, and he covered it with cedar from floor to ceiling. This was a very luxurious place. It was a palace. Now that's what the people are doing. Very possibly, the wood that they're using is wood that had been reserved for the temple. And it was just sitting there, and they keep thinking, well, if it's going to sit there, it's going to rot. We got to put it to good use. So they take it home, and they begin to build. We do know from Ezra 3:7 that King Cyrus had provided money for them to buy hardwood to build the temple. And it's just likely they probably used it for their own homes. Most houses were just dwellings made of stone. That was it. If they did anything on the inside, they whitewashed the walls. And that was all they did. These homes were luxurious. It was something those people in that area had never seen before. And in contrast, they've got these nice homes, and there's the temple of God, the place where God wants to meet with his people, lying in ruins. In ruins. It's in decay. It's desolate. And they're not doing anything about it. How can they say that the time is not right after God moved a pagan king to send them there with all the materials they needed and money and soldiers to protect them on the journey? Fact is, after building the foundation, after putting up with ridicule from opposing forces, they just didn't care anymore. They didn't care what God wanted. They wanted to be comfortable. They wanted their own hope. They stopped doing the work that God had commissioned them to do. I mean, this is why they were sent to the land to build the temple. They quit doing it. You know, I got thinking about that. Someday we're going to face God, and God's going to say, "What'd you do with my great commission? What'd you do? What'd you do about reaching souls? What did you do to help get people saved? How much did you really care? You had plenty of time for your recreation. You had plenty of time for your job. You had plenty of time for your family. You had plenty of time for vacations, but you didn't have enough time to obey the Great Commission." These people didn't have enough time to do the very same thing, to build God's house so that God could work. We're just like them. Our default, I learned this from computers now, we have a default setting. Our default setting is selfishness. If we give no thought to how we're living, we'll automatically live for our own agendas. We'll automatically do what we want to do. A pastor in India, P.J. Matthew, had a great perspective. He said, whenever we face a new year, we must ask ourselves, why has God allowed us to see this new year? Is it so we can enter into greater self-indulgence and serve ourselves during this coming year? Or so we can serve the Lord? Third thing, then he tells them, take time to consider your ways. When God's work is not going forward, we need to consider our ways. What's keeping back the blessings of God? I mean, several times in the Bible you find phrases like, consider your ways, search your heart, examine yourself. There have to be reasons, not usually just one person, though it can be, but there have to be reasons when God is not blessing. Contrary to all that the Jews thought, the glory of the Lord was not going to be in the size of the building, and it wasn't even in the materials from which it was made. The glory of the Lord was when God was there, and they were in His presence. That was the glory of God. And that's when the blessings came. That's when the protection came. That's when the joy came. That's when there was peace. That's when they knew that everything was going to be all right. The greatest blessing we enjoy is when God shows up and His glory fills His house. Now, some folks might not appreciate it, but this preacher likes it a whole bunch when that happens, when God's at work. Folks, the bottom line is that the people were living like they could do life without God at the center. You know, it's very easy for us to do the same thing. We try to do life without God. They thought God was nice, and they didn't deny that. They just didn't see Him as a necessity. They'd settled in the land, and they'd settled spiritually as well. And then Haggai comes on the scene and issues a code red alarm for all of them. So folks, let me ask you today, are you settling? Are you living your life right now without God at the center of it? If you see yourself in that picture, and if you know Christ, then you need to make a commitment to Him today. I mean, at one time, you were zealous for spiritual things. You read your Bible every day. You got involved in serving God. You got involved in witnessing and passing out tracts, and you were faithful. But perhaps your efforts met with difficulties. You got discouraged. You got disillusioned. You encountered some trials that you didn't think were going to happen, and you kind of gave it up. Meanwhile, life just moved on. You started a career. You had a family. You had bills to pay. You had other demands on your time. And church and the Lord's work kind of drifted into the background. You admitted it was a nice thing. You admitted it would be wonderful if you could go. And still, you attend church when you can. But it's when you can't that bothers God. Because God knows it's not that you can't, it's that you won't. It's that you won't. It's time to consider your ways and prioritize your commitments. Let me close with this. I've got a youth pastor friend who every spring spring break takes his teens and young adults down to Fort Lauderdale, and they pass out tracts. They do soul winning there on the beach and on the streets. Now, he was concerned that the teens would get down there and they lose sight of their purpose with everything you're going to see down there, because you see a lot of debauchery, a lot of garbage, and he was concerned about that. So what he did is he built a rugged cross from 2 pieces of wood. It stood about 7 foot high, and just a rugged thing. It wasn't polished and, nothing like that, just very rugged. And before they all climbed on the bus to head south, he said, now look I want you all to remember that the whole purpose of our going is to glorify the name of Christ, to lift up the cross, the message of the cross, the emphasis of the cross, the focus of the cross, the Christ of the cross. So, we're going to take this cross wherever we go. So they took off. Teens are kind of unsure about what this is all about, especially when they stop at a restaurant and he has one of the teens carry the cross inside with them. They go to the motel and they go to register. One of the teens has to carry the cross with them. And they keep it in a different room every night as they make their way there. And at first, when they got to Fort Lauderdale and tried to witness, one of the kids would go out with the cross and he would just stand there and hold the cross. And the other kids would fan out, passing out tracts, whatever. This kid had a pocket full of tracts. As people came by and say, what are you doing? He'd give them the cross. Well, at first it was kind of embarrassing to the group. But then it became a point of identification, kind of a constant silent reminder of who they were and why they had come. They eventually regarded carrying it as an honor and a privilege, and they began to argue over who got to carry it each day. The night before they went home, the youth pastor handed out 2 nails to each person. And he said, if you want to commit yourself to what the cross stands for, I want you to make a decision tonight. He said, I want you to hammer 1 nail into it and keep the other with you. So one by one, the teens did it. They drove a nail into the cross, kept the other with them. 15 years later, one of the fellows called the youth pastor. This fellow was now a stockbroker, not the youth pastor, the other guy. And he said, Pastor Dan, he said, I want you to know I still keep that nail in my desk drawer. And he said, whenever I lose my sense of focus, I look at the nail and I remember the cross on the beach in Florida. And it reminds me of what is at the core of my life, my commitment to Jesus Christ. Now, I didn't bring any nails today. I may try it yet, but I didn't yet. But I do want to tell you this, folks. With a brand new year coming, God needs some people to commit, to make some commitments, to put Him first, to serve Him first, to follow that great commission, to be about what God is about, and to push aside the selfishness. But it's a decision only you can make. I can't make it for you. The person sitting next to you can't make it for you. Just like salvation, your husband can't get saved for you. Your wife can't get saved for you. Mom, you can't get saved for your kids. They have to get saved individually. They've got to receive Christ personally. Maybe you need to start the new year off that way. I like the way CJ he said, it's Christmas, and he said, I want to commit myself to God. Can I get baptized on Christmas Eve? So we started the service with the baptism Wednesday. A young boy who wants to just start his life serving Jesus, and he said it's a good time to start. By the way, the heat wasn't working. It was cold. So I had Pastor Jason baptizing. And when CJ got out, he told his mom, that was the most wonderful, most horrible experience I've ever had. And it works that way. But you know what? Being saved doesn't mean all your troubles fly away. It means you've got somebody to go through them with you.